Hey everybody, welcome back. Last week I did an overview of fuel systems for hot rod applications. I've covered both EFI, return style, deadhead style, and carbureted applications. I did a general overview of what the major parts of a fuel system are. And this week what I want to do is I want to dive a little bit deeper into a few parts of the fuel system, particularly fuel pumps and fuel injectors, how you can determine what size you need, and what some of the factors are that go into determining different types of fuel pumps and injectors that you might use. If you haven't seen last week's video, I highly recommend you go watch it. That will give you a general primer on fuel systems and what types of things you need to watch out for. I'm not going to go over the entire thing again. I'm going to get mostly into the specifics of fuel injectors and fuel pumps. So let's dive into it. Before we get started, I want to tell you that if you have any questions about any of this, if there's anything that I can explain clear to you, I'd be happy to answer you in the comments. So I hope you enjoy the video, and I hope this helps break things down. I really want to help people have less barrier of entry when building their hot rod, when figuring out how this stuff works. So I think this video is going to give you a really good overview on how you can choose a fuel pump, how you can choose a fuel injectors, and if you have any questions or want any more specific recommendations, give me a comment and I'll get back to you quickly. Just as a general overview, right here I have the overview of a typical return style fuel injection setup. You've got a fuel tank and pump. You have a vent to make sure that there's neither pressure or vacuum in the tank. You have a rollover valve to make sure that fuel doesn't spill on the ground in the event of an accident. The pump provides pressure to the supply line, which goes through a fuel filter, which goes to the fuel rail. The fuel rail distributes fuel to the fuel injectors. Beyond the fuel rail, the fuel pressure regulator maintains all of the pressure in the backside of the system and bypasses any excess fuel not necessary to maintain that pressure to the return line, which ends up back in the tank. Today I want to talk about how you can pick a fuel pump and fuel injectors for your setup. So to pick adequately fuel injectors and a fuel pump, you need to start with your engine, with your fuel system requirements. There's a metric referred to as brake-specific fuel consumption, which measures how much fuel it takes to make power. This measurement is typically expressed in pounds of fuel required to make 1 horsepower for an hour. You'll see this as pounds per hour. I have a couple of typical numbers here for E85 and for gasoline. 0.63 pounds per hour for naturally aspirated EFI, E85, and 0.7 pounds per hour for forced induction EFI applications. Similarly, 0.45 pounds for gasoline and half a pound when under forced induction. These are ballpark figures, not specific figures. If you're running high boost, you could easily exceed these numbers in the amount of fuel that you need. Do not take this as the gospel for your fuel requirements. Do more research, particularly on your engine platform and the type of boost or power adder that you're going to be running. This is just a general kind of guideline. In this example, you could see that you're at 400 horsepower times a forced induction value of gasoline at half a pound brake-specific fuel consumption. The fuel system would need to be capable of delivering 200 pounds of fuel to the engine every hour. You could see this as you need a pump capable of supplying 200 pounds an hour and fuel injectors that altogether, all of the injectors are capable of delivering 200 pounds per hour to the engine. You definitely want to have a margin of error and leave room to grow. Part of the reason that forced induction applications tend to see a larger brake-specific fuel consumption number than naturally aspirated applications is the air-fuel ratio. A naturally aspirated aspiration tends to run between 12 and 13 to 1 at wide open throttle when you're making peak power. You need a little bit more than stoichiometric to keep the cylinder cool, to stave off detonation, and still make peak power. Under forced induction, you need a lot more fuel. Not only are you putting more air into the engine, but you're also putting a lot more heat into the engine with that air, and you need more fuel to keep it cool. It's not uncommon for forced induction applications to run 11 to 1 or even 10 to 1 AFR. When you're dealing with the amount of fuel that you're going to be delivering to the engine, you want to leave yourself a buffer. If you're going to be making 400 horsepower and you need 200 pounds of fuel every hour to the engine, you don't want to rely on the pump that's only rated at 200 pounds an hour. You want to be able to have that pump deliver more fuel in case you're at density altitude below sea level, or just so that you have a safety margin built in if the pump starts to go out or if the pump doesn't quite make what's advertised. Generally, a ballpark figure is to have 20% more fuel system than what the engine should need. So instead of 200 pounds an hour, you would want a fuel pump capable of flowing probably 240 or 250 pounds per hour. When you're looking at these things, it's important not to confuse pounds per hour, gallons per hour, and liters per hour. Fuel pumps are typically rated in either gallons per hour or liters per hour. Liters per hour is becoming more dominant, and fuel injectors are most commonly rated in pounds per hour, but can be rated in the amount of cc's that they flow. So I recommend using pounds per hour for fuel injectors and liters per hour for fuel pumps. That's what most manufacturers are publishing their numbers in, but just watch that when you're mixing and matching parts. In addition to your fuel pump and fuel injectors, it's important to make sure that every other part of the system is capable of flowing enough fuel. So you wouldn't want to flow 255 liters per hour through a 5/16 fuel line. That's probably too small. You probably need at least a 3/8 fuel line. Similarly, you want to make sure that your regulator is capable of handling all of the flow that your fuel pump puts out. You want to make sure that your fuel rail is large enough that you don't have a pressure drop across it. I'm going to do more videos in the future, probably in the next couple weeks, covering most of these things, what you need to look for. But just keep that in mind as you're developing your fuel system. Bigger is usually better, except bigger injectors can affect the quality of idle and quality of part throttle. But in general, it's always safer to have more fuel system than you need. Not having enough will cause you to run lean, and that can damage your engine. So I'm actually going to start with fuel injectors. Fuel injectors are kind of the life of the engine. They provide the fuel. You need to do some math calculating how much fuel injector you need. And it's just a little bit more than the brake-specific fuel consumption math we did on the last slide. And right here I've prepared an example turbo E85 V8 setup targeting 800 horsepower. So I'm going to plug in a brake-specific fuel consumption of 0.7 pounds per 1 horsepower for an hour for E85. Using that figure times 800 horsepower, crank horsepower. We don't know what drivetrain losses are going to be. We're going to do all of this math in crank horsepower. Times 800 horsepower equals 560 pounds per hour. Now this is a V8 application, so we would expect to have 8 injectors, 1 at every intake runner. So that's 560 pounds per hour divided by 8 injectors means every injector needs to flow 70 pounds per hour. Now it's very important right here to stay consistent with one metric for the entire equation. You can't put liters per hour on one side and pounds per hour on the other and mix and match. They don't convert directly like that. You have to convert. If you have a number that is in pounds per hour and you need to convert it to liters per hour, there's an online calculator for that. There's a conversion rate for that. If you need to go the other way, there's a conversion rate for that. If you need to go from liters per hour to cc's, there's a conversion for that. Do not mix and match liters per hour, pounds per hour, gallons per hour, cc's. Don't mix and match. When you're doing your math, make sure everything is accurate in the same value so that you get good numbers at the end of it. So real quick, 0.7 pounds times 800 horsepower means we need 560 pounds per hour. That 560 divided between 8 injectors means each injector needs to be capable of flowing 70 pounds per hour. 70 pounds times a 25% safety margin, 125%, is 87.5 pounds per hour. That's kind of a weird size. You'd probably see the injectors that you want rated at 90 pounds per hour in this application. That's not extremely oversized. And if you're going with high quality injectors, Decas or Holley makes injectors, Phytech makes injectors, going with the high quality, reputable brand, you're probably going to spend at least $400, $500, $600 on them. But this will give you a high quality injector that has good control. Injectors operate using what's called a duty cycle. So if an injector is at 100% duty cycle, that means the injector should be open 100% of the time. If the injector is at a 5% duty cycle, the injector should be open 5% of the time. Now, there is a little bit more to injectors. They have an opening rate and a closing rate, and they have a response time that can vary with the voltage that they're running at. There's a little bit more math that most EFI systems make pretty easy, and any reputable injector manufacturer is going to publish all of these numbers, but it's important to know that these things exist. The main thing is it's important to understand how this duty cycle works, and you may be idling at a 1 or 2 or 3% duty cycle, or sometimes even less than a percent. If you have a very large injector, you might be idling at a half of a percent duty cycle, and the injector opening and closing rate may be inconsistent enough or may be long enough that it's difficult to get a consistent flow of fuel at idle. This is where high quality injectors really make a big difference. Is if you're running a high quality injector, it's going to be much more stable in the amount of fuel that it flows at low duty cycle, and in the opening and closing rate, at its rate with voltage. Its numbers are going to be more accurate to what the manufacturer recommends. If you buy some cheap Chinese injectors or refurbished OEM injectors that are probably actually, a knockoff manufactured with no quality control, you don't know what you're getting. So it's important to run a high quality injector. You'll have much better success. Something else that is an important consideration is high and low impedance injectors. Most injectors are high impedance injectors. That means they have a high resistance value. A ECU or PCM will only be able to handle a certain amount of current flow through an injector. The PCM or ECU has to be capable of handling whatever current the injector draws. If it draws a tenth of an amp or a half of an amp or something, the ECU has to be able to handle that. A high impedance injector will not handle very much, will not create very much current flow. A low impedance injector is going to flow a lot of current. It's going to have a low resistance flow, a lot of current, and that means the ECU has to be able to handle that. Most factory and aftermarket ECUs do not handle low impedance injectors out of the box. You need some kind of special control module or injector driver to run low impedance injectors. In certain applications, low impedance injectors are necessary. They'll flow more fuel. They'll have better fuel control at low duty cycle, but they also tend to be pretty expensive, and you need a special injector driver to use them. So don't use a low impedance injector with a factory ECU or with most aftermarket ECUs. You need to make sure that it's compatible with the ECU setup that you're running. Something else to consider is not all injectors are the same height. Some are tall, some are short, some have different connectors on them. You need to make sure that you have the correct connector for the harness that you're using. They make a lot of injector adapters for different harnesses, for different factory style injectors. There's at least 3 or 4 different ones that are common on GM LS stuff. I'm not super familiar with the other main hot rod stuff, Honda engines and Coyote motors. I'm not sure what connectors those tend to use, but Just make sure that the injectors you're using match the connector for your harness, or that there's an adapter available. Something that I wanted to touch on is in some high-end applications, you'll see staged banks of injectors. This might mean that there's one set of injectors that runs all the time and another set of injectors that runs only when performance demands the increased flow. Old school nitrous setups kind of did this. There are wet systems and dry systems, and there are also kind of hybrid systems where they have a second bank of injectors that only runs when the nitrous is activated. You can have a second bank of injectors that's only run when you're in boost. There's lots of different ways that these can be configured. They're not extremely common and not extremely necessary. Modern fuel injectors have gotten very reliable and very consistent, as long as you're buying from a reputable brand. But it's something to consider that may or may not be necessary for your setup, or you may have bought a car that has an older staged injection setup on it. Moving on to the fuel pump. The fuel pump works. There's several different styles of fuel pump. The flow is very similar in how it's calculated to the flow of an injector. You start with your brake-specific fuel consumption and multiply it by your horsepower target. I'm going to use the same 800 horsepower V8 E85 example, turbo E85 example here. So a brake-specific fuel consumption of 0.7 times 800 horsepower is still 560 pounds per hour. A 25% margin says still 700 pounds per hour. Now, most fuel pumps are rated in liters per hour, not pounds per hour. So I'm going to convert that 700 pounds per hour to liters per hour. There's a conversion rate. I used a calculator online, and that works out to 441 liters per hour. So there are several different ways that several different schemes you can have a fuel pump set up to achieve this 441 liter per hour figure. You can run a single in-tank pump, probably a like Hellcat pump they're being called. There's several large pumps available. Holley makes some, Walbro makes some. It seems like the Hellcat pumps are available and very popular for the kind of power level where you would want that much flow. You can run a dual in-tank pump setup. You could run two 255 liter per hour pumps and have it where one comes on over 70% throttle or something when you're going to need the increased flow, where one is on all the time and one comes on at 70% throttle. You can run a very high flow inline pump. They make dual inline pumps. Holley makes a bunch of different inline pumps. Phytech makes stuff. There's a lot of good stuff on the market. You would want to do research. Personally, I'm a fan of in-tank pumps. In-tank pumps tend to run cooler because they're submerged in fuel. The in-tank pump can be cooled by the fuel, and the fuel is cooled by the tank walls. If you have an inline pump, it is cooled by the fuel, but it's not submerged. It's not getting as much of that cooling effect. The only negative to an in-tank pump, in my opinion, is that it's difficult to get to in a fuel tank situation. If you have a fuel cell, it's fairly easy to get to, and I definitely would go in-tank. The other kind of obnoxious thing about an in-tank pump is that when you're first setting it up, it can be difficult to get the wires run through a factory-style fuel pump hanger. But if you're running something aftermarket that already has a solution for that, that's still no problem. Real quick, I'll touch on, there are mechanical pumps that are mostly intended for carbureted applications. This is an example of a mechanical pump here. These are driven by a push rod that is pushed by a lobe on the camshaft. These tend to be low pressure, like 5 to 7 psi, and there are high volume, high flow versions of these pumps available, higher than factory. In a carbureted application, the carburetor has a small float bowl, which is like a little reservoir of fuel, and it's important to be able to keep that full if you're at wide open throttle for an extended period. So you might need a higher flow than factory pump if you're running a carburetor on a high performance engine, or especially if you're running multiple carburetors on a high performance engine. Personally, excuse me. Personally, even in a carbureted application, I might run a in-tank fuel pump. They do make fairly low pressure in-tank fuel pumps, and they make fuel pump regulators that can regulate down to carburetor level pressures. An on-engine pump is fine, but depending on the manufacturer of your pump, especially if you're getting a stock replacement type, the diaphragms don't always hold up to modern ethanols that are in today's gasolines, and that's something to watch out for. Ethanol is actually something you need to watch for no matter what pump you're running. Many pumps are not compatible with E85 or with high ethanol content. So that's something to watch out for. Something I'll touch on right now is when you have an in-tank fuel pump, you have a submersible fuel hose or line that goes from the pump to the pass-through on the sending unit on the fuel pump hanger. It's important that that be compatible with whatever fuel you're running. You can't just take a regular piece of carburetor or even EFI fuel hose and stick it on there. It won't hold up to extended submersion. The inner rubber tends to be of a different material than the outer rubber on fuel hose. So you need to make sure that what you have is submersible. It's become very popular to use these nylon flex hose lines. They are E85 compatible and generally hold up extremely well for long periods of time. In addition to simple single fuel pump or dual staged fuel pump setups, it is possible to have a large fuel pump that is controlled by a PWM controller. The PWM controller works by pulsing power to the fuel pump on and off many times per second, sometimes 500, 600, 1,000 times per second. Those are measured in hertz, and hertz is simply a measurement of on and off per second. What this does is it can cause a pump to run cooler. By not having as much current through the pump will typically run cooler. And oftentimes a high flow pump, a pump that flows 340 or 500 liters per hour, will flow plenty of fuel at half throttle, at half duty cycle for a stock engine or for an engine where you're just cruising. You would need an EFI controller capable of telling your PWM controller when to increase fuel flow. The PWM controller could be switched so that it comes on at 50% throttle or 70% throttle, or when a certain boost number is reached or something like that, and it would ramp up 50%, 70%, 90%, 100% fuel flow. Or I should say 100% duty cycle, which would turn into increased fuel flow, up to 100% fuel flow of what the pump's capable of providing. Again, it's super important that your pump be matched to your fuel pressure regulator. If you have a fuel pump that can flow 441 liters per hour or 500 liters per hour, your fuel pressure regulator has to be able to flow 500 liters per hour. If you're running two 255 liter per hour fuel pumps, that's 510 total liters per hour that your system's capable of flowing. Your fuel pressure regulator needs to be capable of handling that. If you have too small of a fuel pressure regulator, you'll increase pressure if you're running a standard return style, and if you're running a deadhead style, you might not get enough pressure. There's more nuances, but this should give you enough information to choose a fuel pump given how much fuel you need to supply. Where fuel pumps are concerned, idle quality is less of an issue as long as you're using well-matched components. So I would recommend that you give yourself plenty of room to grow. If you're starting off with something like a naturally aspirated 5.3 liter and you might eventually put a turbo on it, my recommendation would be to run more fuel pump than you need so that down the road it's easy to go forced induction. If you're planning on running gasoline right now but want to be able to run E85 on track days, or might want to run E85 under boost later, go with a bigger pump right now. Personally, I can say I'm not a fan of PWM controlled setups. They are known to be problematic. They're known to have failures. They're known to be difficult to set up. And some pumps don't run well with them. So you need to do research and make sure that your pump is compatible with a PWM controller. There's lots and lots of options. Personally, I've used a couple of Walbro pumps and been happy with them, but I know Holley makes a lot of good pumps. I know Phytech makes good pumps. There's lots of options out there, so don't limit yourself to one pump just based on this video. Go out and do research on different pumps for your application. I hope this video has helped you. I'd be very happy to answer any questions in the comments. I'm by no means a complete expert on everything fuel system related, but I do think that this provides a pretty good overview on what you need to consider when looking at injectors and fuel pumps. Make sure everything's compatible with the fuel you want to run. Make sure that you have sufficient flow for your horsepower target. Make sure that your units are all the same and that you do any necessary conversions when mixing and matching different parts, when doing your math, when doing your calculations. This stuff's pretty straightforward, and I hope that this video has helped you to understand how you can choose your system components. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give me a like and a subscribe. I am trying to do a lot more educational videos like this. I'm going to be showing you some real life stuff in the future on my projects. I have a couple projects in the works, and I have a few buddies' cars that we're going to be doing some upgrades on this year, and I am super excited to be able to share that with you. So please give me a like and subscribe. You can also find me on Instagram @LugnutLang and TikTok @LugnutLang. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this.